right? So the idea of the civilian is a peculiar way of conceptualizing people that evolved during World War I. So at the time of World War I, governments acknowledged the vital role of non-combatants in the modern industrialized war machine, and military strategists described them as key military targets. It was taken for granted that citizens would be targeted in a war because they were part of a war machine. So we had this paradoxical reconstruction of non-combatants as both weak and critically important, as both pitiful victims and dangerous adversaries. It's hard to imagine a world where you don't have civilians. And civilians are talked about as though this concept has long existed. But the term and the group it describes are new. The word civilian, in the sense of a non-military person, only began to be used in the mid-19th century. And the current concept of the civilian is only defined in 1977 in the additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Accords. So we have this whole new definition of the civilian, and we have these new ways of conceiving of non-combatants, and this all developed in World War I. So we got the use of civilian to designate non-military persons, but in World War I, they did not have the connotation of protected or victimized non-combatants. So it was common during World War I to write about civilian spies or civilian belligerents, right? Terms that now sound weird. So non-combatant was used to describe members of the military who did not fight. So non-combatant or civilian was used to describe the general non-military population. But it's more common to use a term such as private citizen, private individual, or private subject. So the private citizen was a particular concept of the non-combatant. So the great legal scholars writing before the First World War recognized this concept. They were proud of it. They thought of it as an achievement of Western civilization. Gone were the days when the entire population was liable to be killed, robbed, or exiled. So traditionally, the men would be killed, the women would be raped, and the women and the children might be taken into captivity. Right? And so the leading scholars prior to World War I who talked about citizens, they attributed the change to the philosophy of Rousseau, who in 1801 argued that war was a relationship between states, not between men. Men were involved simply because they were citizens, but only when they were soldiers. So these legal scholars would praise Rousseau, but they'd claim he was wrong in practice, that citizens of an enemy state are enemies too. So traditionally, the inhabitants of Gaza would be regarded as legitimate enemies of Israel, but not combatants, all right? If they withhold themselves from fighting, then they are passive enemies. So it's not necessary to injure them in the prosecution of a war. So it was taken for granted as a fundamental principle of war that everything should be done to win the war, right? So prior to World War I, what Israel is up against in Gaza would be that, number one, the most expected guiding principle for Israel should be to win the war. But it was hoped that passive enemies would not be deliberately injured. But if by placing pressure on the general population can bring the war to a speedy conclusion, then it will be allowed as a necessity of war.